This week's episode of the ArtTactic Podcast is brought to you by ArtTactic.com. This year, ArtTactic is celebrating 25 years of trusted art market insight, backed by rigorous analysis and independent research. To learn more about all of our products, visit ArtTactic.com. Thanks for listening to the ArtTactic Podcast. I'm your host, Adam Green. There's been an incredible amount of attention focused on the new building at LACMA since it opened just last week. Designed by Peter Zumthor, it's hard to recall the last time a museum building has generated this much buzz, not just within the art world, but even more broadly. And it comes at a very interesting time for the LA art scene. It's of course been gaining serious momentum over the last few years, with the arrival of Frieze LA, as well as several galleries expanding or opening new spaces across the city. To help us unpack what's driving the conversation around the new building at LACMA and whether it lives up to expectations, in this week's episode of the podcast, we're joined by Jori Finkel, an LA-based journalist who writes for the New York Times and the art newspaper. Jori recently visited the new building and published an in-depth review in the art newspaper, which I definitely recommend you read. And she's kind enough to join us to share her perspective on the experience and what the new building may mean for the city's cultural landscape moving forward. We hope you enjoy our conversation. Thanks so much for listening. Jori, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Adam, and I'm always happy to talk about LACMA. It's the hot ticket right now in Los Angeles. Everyone has tried to visit already or made their visit already, or is in line to visit in the next week or two. It is not a perfect building, but I am a fan. I think it did the essential things well. At the architecture, we're talking about the new Zumthor space now, which is this very horizontal, swooping concrete and glass structure that is perched above the land, above the city a little bit, on a series of legs or pavilions, as they call them. So as I wrote in the review, I feel that at its best, this building is glorious. There's almost something cathedral-like about it, which is odd considering how much concrete there is.
Yeah, and that's really one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on. I mean, we don't do a podcast normally for a museum opening, but it feels like there's just been so much buzz about the new building at LACMA. And I guess there in LA, it seems like a lot of people are trying to get tickets and get there as fast as they can.
Yeah, absolutely. I think they've had a preview period for the last 2 or 3 weeks. So a lot of people have been making their way through the building. They also had a preview over the summer of the building when it was empty, which I think was a really smart move. So we could see the architecture. It also built some suspense. How would the architecture actually work for the art? And on that, I'm more mixed, that the architecture doesn't work perfectly for all kinds of art. It makes the antiquities in the collection, in LACMA's collection, look extraordinary. Clay, stone, wood pieces look really good. Paintings are much, much trickier to hang on these concrete walls, which are tinted in order to create some atmosphere.
Yeah, I really can't wait to get to LA myself. The install shots look really remarkable. But before we even get into the LACMA building, I wanted to ask you a little bit about the museum landscape in LA. Which institutions feel like they have the most momentum, and how has that perhaps shifted in recent years? I'm sure many of our listeners go to LA perhaps once a year during Frieze or maybe every other year, and during their visits, they pop into one or a few museums based on whichever shows are resonating most with them. But I think being there on the ground, being based in LA, you really get a feel for the institutions and which ones are performing best and how their statuses locally have evolved or shifted over the last several years.
I would say 100%. You're right, Adam. The energy is shifting. LA is a very dynamic museum scene where museums are still new to some degree, or they're being renewed. So there has been a lot changing on the museum scene lately. I mean, I could say that when I moved here from New York in 2004, MoCA was the big game in town. Since then, the Hammer Museum developed a really important contemporary art program. Also bigger staff than MoCA. It actually became the bigger contemporary museum in town over the course of the last decade or two. And LACMA has dramatically changed since the arrival of Michael Govan in 2006. He built two new buildings before the building that we're talking about. So before the Zumthor building, he built BCAM, originally maybe to house Eli Broad's collection, but it didn't turn out that way. And then the Resnick Pavilion across the way. And maybe even more importantly than the buildings, he created this piazza or plaza where people went to LACMA just to hang out, just to have a coffee, just to meet someone, modeled really on the way that piazzas work in Italy. I think Michael Govan had spent some time in Rome. And so he thought about a town square and how important that would be for a city where people drive everywhere and get stuck in traffic all the time. So all of these museums have been in flux really over the last few years. And then there are smaller museums. I mean, they're the museums that opened and then closed, like the Underground and the Marciano, that have added to the energy here. And then the Broad has become a major player as well. And they're actually undergoing an expansion. So in a few years, we're going to see an even larger Broad Museum downtown. So there has been a lot going on. And this is really not a zero-sum game. Having a couple stronger museums in town bring the money, the attention, the energy needed so that the other museums can improve as well. So I think we're seeing overall a stronger museum scene than we've seen in years past. And we're going to see another kind of museum opening in September that isn't getting a lot of attention yet, which is the Lucas Museum. And that will have a collection of Star Wars memorabilia, but also what they're calling narrative art, which is basically his collection of Norman Rockwell paintings, Robert Crumb comics, storytelling based art. So it feels like a very vital museum scene right now.
Yeah, I think what you're describing really is like the quote, "A rising tide lifts all boats." I don't know how competitive the museums are in LA with one another, but it seems, especially for the art ecosystem in LA, which is still growing and developing in many ways, when you have one museum that's really thriving, in a way, it helps all the other museums in the entire ecosystem.
I think so. I think where they're competitive is for board members, of course, that you could see maybe one of the reasons MoCA has been suffering in recent years. They have an important show right now, the Monuments exhibition, but that's kind of far and few between for MoCA to have these important shows. They just haven't been punching at their weight level for a while. And I think part of that is board attrition, that some ways Michael Govan started creating a really interesting board, looking for not just millionaires, but the billionaire art collectors in town and the Hammer as well. And so in that case, you have boards, you do have some competition there because you really can't be on all these boards at the same time.
Sure. And so I think for our listeners who have not been following the development and really the timeline of this new building at LACMA so closely, I think it'd be great if you could walk us through just how all of this came together, from the original vision to some of the key decision makers to the funding and kind of the full timeline to completion.
I mean, I think LACMA has recognized for a long time that some of their older buildings, mainly designed by William Pereira, were not working. They were leaking. They had some seismic updating issues where they needed a lot of work that way. And they weren't working for artists. I always give the example of Diana Thader because she showed in both the old spaces and then in one of the new spaces like BCAM. And she said when she showed in these old spaces that she had to apologize to people who came to see her shows from Europe, that the spaces were that inhospitable to art.
Wow.
So I think there was, and this goes back 20, 30 years, that LACMA knew they needed new building. And there were different proposals at different times. There was a Rem Koolhaas proposal that was tent-like, if I remember correctly, that would cover a great big space with a tent that never got made, never got off the ground. When Michael Govan arrived, he also recognized that these buildings needed to be replaced. And I think he had Peter Zumthor in mind from the start. He didn't go out asking other architects for proposals. I remember seeing the first designs that they unveiled, some sketches, and originally the building was meant to be a lot curvier. Some people compared it to an ink blot. I think that Peter Zumthor himself compared the building shape. He called it his black flower. It was going to be black originally. It is not black any longer, so that's been a change. But it was a kind of organic shape. It looked like a Hans Arp sculpture. And I think one of the biggest things to happen in the last 10 years is that design was changed pretty dramatically for a lot of practical reasons. I think one of the turning points came in 2014 when LACMA was told by their neighboring museum, the Page Museum, that governs the tar pits nearby, that they could not actually take up that much land. It was going to endanger some fossils in the tar pits. So not only does LACMA have to think about seismic issues because we're basically on a fault line here in California, but LACMA is so close to tar pits that every time they dig into that land at all, they're coming up with fossils. So they were basically asked not to go so close to the tar pits in their design, and they had to rethink the design. And that caused a real change that we can see in the museum today and can experience. At the time, it seemed like it might not be a good change. The change is that they decided in order to get that space, the museum would have to bridge over Wilshire Boulevard and use a parking lot that LACMA owned to get that extra space. So the museum design itself shifted, compressed in a way, became more angular. But as a result, the museum spanning Wilshire Boulevard is actually one of the greatest things about it, that you can walk over Wilshire Boulevard, you can stand. One of the things this museum does is frame Wilshire Boulevard traffic as something worth looking at. And it actually is. It's actually beautiful in a way to see this main artery of LA kind of flying by underneath you at all times of day. So that was interesting to see. Of course, the pandemic slowed down construction. Construction costs did balloon from about 640 million to 724 is the last figure we were given. And so it took longer than expected. I think the big date originally was 2024. They hope to open in 2024 at the same time as the Metro. Well, they just opened in 2026 and the Metro will be opening next week.
Yeah, not bad. And so I know you've touched on it already a little bit, but for those of us who haven't visited the new building yet, how would you describe the experience of moving through the galleries, and ultimately how different does it feel compared to, say, a more traditional museum layout?
Yeah, well, the thing to keep in mind is that the perimeter of the building is glass. So you can see out, if you walk just along the perimeter, you can see out, you have views to all directions and the views over Wilshire Boulevard that I mentioned. And a lot of light coming in. Because they don't want so much light coming in, some objects are very light sensitive, they hired a Japanese designer to create these very thin, beautiful metallic curtains. There's a thin version of the curtain, a thick version of the curtain, and then there are different combinations of the curtains so they can modulate the light as much as they need to. So sometimes the light's coming in unfiltered, sometimes behind these, through these curtains. And basically, when you walk along the perimeters, what you'll mainly get are sculptures and objects. Paintings need more protection, so they're tucked away into the galleries inside the building. So it creates this, it kind of is an inversion in some ways of a traditional museum structure. We talk a lot about encyclopedic museums, and the people at LACMA will tell you it's not really an encyclopedic museum because it doesn't cover that many cultures, that many periods. Or if you think of it through that lens, it's an encyclopedic museum with many flaws, many gaps. So the way that they're handling the art, presenting the art, thinking about the art is not in terms of an encyclopedic museum presentation at all. So what you get instead are these vignettes in the museum. You know, for example, on one of the perimeter galleries, we'll have objects from the ancient Americas, including these incredible Mexican sculptures. When you go inside into an interior gallery, there's one devoted to car culture, and you get a Studebaker, an actual car in the gallery space, the Studebaker designed by Raymond Loewy. So you have these different small vignettes or stories that the museum is telling instead of telling one grand narrative about the history of art, capital H, capital A.
Yeah, it seems like a really interesting way to look at art. I can't wait to see the layout myself. So how has the LACMA rebuild been received so far from a broader group? So maybe among all the critics or from the LA art community or even the broader LA public? Is there a consensus?
I think it's a mix, and I think that's a good thing that people should not all have the same opinions. I know there's a lot of skepticism from people who haven't seen it yet. It just sounds bad. Mixing all these cultures together sounds bad to them, or the expense sounds bad to them. But yeah, I feel like the reviews overall have been positive. The two New York Times reviews, Holland Cotter reviewed the art installation and Michael Kimmelman reviewed the architecture to the extent that you can divide those two up. And both of those were overwhelmingly positive. I felt that my review started out very positive, but by the end, I was focused on a couple things that LACMA could do better and could still do better. It's not necessarily built into the building, but I felt that in not telling this story of, they're trying to avoid telling a story of art history that favors European art history and builds to this moment. Let's the apotheosis, call it French Impressionism, call it New York abstract expressionism, right? In it trying to avoid these grand narratives, I felt that they didn't tell enough of a story about the objects they were showing. There aren't enough wall panels. When you click through the app to get more information, there's still not enough of a story in some cases. Like, you want to know what these objects are and why they're important, while the initial presentation really, really wants you just to wander through and make your own connections, which I appreciate. I appreciate, both. You want to give people a direct and immediate experience with art. I get that. But for anyone whose curiosity is sparked, isn't it the role of curators and museum educators to give us a little more information? There's a table of ceramics, for example, and this may be one of the best examples, where there's a large table of ceramics from different countries, Japanese ceramics, California studio ceramics from the mid-century, mid-20th century, where they don't even identify the makers of the ceramics. You don't know who made what. The beautiful thing about the table is there's no glass around it. I've had some friends say, "Oh, this is a disaster waiting to happen. Someone's going to knock into that." And the museum said, "No, they're very, very well secured on the table." But I think it's a wonderful effect to be able to get that close to the ceramic and not have to deal with a glass display case blocking your view. So there's an immediacy there. You can you can kind of walk next to the ceramics, look on top of the ceramics. There's physical pleasure there. There's a sensual pleasure there. But where is the intellectual component if you want to learn who these makers were, or you want to learn something more about it? Why do the California pots have such ashy glazes? What's going on there? And there's a total lack of information.
Wow, that's really interesting. Well, it is just the opening now, so perhaps they will make some modifications or changes to the visitor experience. And so before we let you go, I want to ask you one last question. If we look ahead to the future, I'm curious, what kind of ripple effects do you think LACMA's rebuild might actually have on the broader LA art ecosystem?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. That's the question everyone's wondering. I think it has to. I mean, first of all, this isn't done in isolation, right? That, as I mentioned before, the Lucas is also opening later this year. The Broad is expanding by 2028. And what is 2028? 2028 is when the Olympics are coming to LA. So, the idea that we're trying to get our cultural institutions ready for showtime, that's not a new idea. We've seen other cities do it. We've seen other cities do it more or less successfully. So I do think we are, from the Olympics alone, we are bound to see more cultural tourism in LA. How much of it can we attribute to this building? That's going to be hard to say. But I do think that this sets LACMA on a more international path, or this makes LACMA a more international destination. One of the shocking things for me in following the LA art scene for so long was to see how low attendance was at some of these institutions. That we're talking hundreds of thousands of visitors a year instead of millions. And in LACMA's case, they did have just over 1 million visitors a year, maybe 2 million at the most. But they were primarily from the region. They did not draw a lot of people from out of the country or even out of the state. And most major museums, it's the opposite. Even the Getty is the opposite. The Getty would have 80% international visitors, and LACMA would have 80% local or regional visitors. So I think that much is going to change, that LACMA with this building has made a bid for attention from people who like to see art wherever they live, wherever they travel. So LACMA is going to be on the map more for international travelers, I think.
Yeah, I know there's already a lot of excitement from people who aren't based in LA who want to check out the new building when they're next in town. Jori, thanks so much again for coming on the podcast and reflecting on your initial experiences in the new LACMA building. And if our listeners haven't already, they should definitely check out your in-depth review in the art newspaper. And if our listeners want to follow you on social media, where can we find you there?
I'm at Jori Finkel, easy that way. Thank you so much, Adam, for having me on and giving LA some attention.
Absolutely. Talk soon.
Okay, take care. Bye bye.